Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Abby Evans. I'm the Senior Director for Government Relations at Mentor. I am a white woman with dark curly hair. Today I'm wearing glasses and a striped shirt, and I use she, her pronouns.
Hi, everyone. My name is Caden Fabi. I am the policy manager with Mentor. Today I'm wearing a gray V-neck t-shirt, and I am sitting in front of a brick wall in my basement apartment. Great to be here with you all. And my pronouns are he, him.
Excellent. So I think we're going to go ahead and jump right into our slides for today. While Caden's bringing that up, just wanted to thank you again for your time. Grassroots advocacy is something obviously we are very excited about and is part and parcel to our success in the work we do here in DC. So thank you for your interest and for joining today. So we'll go right to the agenda, and we've broken this presentation into 4 sort of digestible sections for you. Obviously, we're going to talk about why advocacy, why you should advocate. We're going to talk a little bit about the kinds of tactics you can take. Caden's going to walk you through some ways to engage, including things you can do today, right now, right this very second. And then Caden put together this really fantastic Q&A with 2 congressional staffers who work for members of Congress who are good supporters of youth mentoring on Capitol Hill here in DC. So we're really excited to hear from them. We are very interested in hearing from you. So throughout this presentation, feel free to use the question box to drop questions in. And we definitely want you to ask questions of the congressional staff who are going to join us. So keep thinking as we're going throughout some questions you'd love to ask congressional staff because they're friendly and that's what they're here for. So we can move on to the next slide, please. So we're going to move right to why. And I think for me, advocacy is really about needed change. That can look different from person to person, from community to community, from ideology to ideology, but that's really what advocacy boils down to, and identifying something that needs to change. And we thought it was really important to sort of think about this from different lenses, why you might be motivated to advocate. And I think, community and systems level change require engagement with public policy. And just to be really clear, what we mean in this instance, when we talk about systems, we're talking about those entities, those things we interact with that are in whole or in part run by or funded by government. So law enforcement, the public education system, child welfare system, juvenile justice system, criminal justice system. Medicare is another system, right? Driving on roads, driving on bridges. The infrastructure is a big topic right now in the country, and certainly here in Washington. These are all things that our systems are very directly impacted by government in whole, in part, or paid for with public money, i.e. taxpayer dollars. So we are all interacting with systems and publicly funded things day in and day out. Some things we're more aware of than others. So that's a motivation. The very fact that you work with or work for or volunteer with a nonprofit entity, nonprofits were created because of public policy. The very fact that you are tax exempt as a nonprofit comes about because of law and regulation and policy. And the ability of policy to impact how successfully nonprofits can achieve their goals and missions is very, very real. It's relatively simple as how the federal government is defining the ways that individuals can mark tax exempt items on their tax returns every year, all the way up to how things for employees are taxed, how all kinds of things, right? It impacts the way you're able to do things. For youth serving organizations, many of you are probably youth serving organizations. There are likely rules at the local, state, and federal level that in some way impact, for instance, how you screen the adults who will be interacting with young people, whether they be staff or volunteers, all kinds of things. And then, of course, there's that individualized motivation, right? So many of us, particularly in the nonprofit sector, are driven by our desire to serve our communities and make a meaningful difference. Mentoring, being a volunteer mentor, is one really, really impactful way to make a meaningful difference in the life of a young person or young people. And we love that. Another way that your engaged and fantastic volunteer mentors can support your organization is to support the policy and advocacy goals that you have. So ultimately, we need to think about this work as how we're enacting change. And move on to the next slide, please. So there's a couple of different kinds of advocacy, and honestly, they all sort of bleed into each other. We're obviously going to focus on the last bullet, but the first is thinking about policy and advocacy as an education or awareness campaign. If any of you have participated in Capitol Hill Day that Mentor hosts every year, you've heard me say that the advocacy you're doing, that grassroots advocacy you're doing on Hill Day, really is part and parcel about education. You're imparting your knowledge and your experience to congressional staff and members of Congress, and then flagging for them ways that that knowledge and experience interacts with policy and funding opportunities under their purview. Direct lobbying is work that Caden and I invest in here in DC on a pretty regular basis. Direct lobbying, in this case, as federal lobbyists, we are registered, which requires us to file quarterly lobbying reports and twice annual contribution reports, which means any donations we make at a certain threshold to federal candidates, we have to declare. So the work we're doing is very transparent, and we're meeting with congressional staff and members of Congress and saying very specific things, right? HR 123 will do X. We would like you to co-sponsor it and vote yes when it's on the floor next week, right? We're being very clear about what specific bills, policies, legislation, funding opportunities there are, and what desired action we want from that office. It's very clear, very direct. Grassroots advocacy is a little of both of those, but it sort of takes the pressure off you. Thinking about it first and foremost as education, I think is really valuable, because whether or not you consider yourself an expert doesn't really matter. You're imparting what you know and what you experience and what you witness day to day. And depending on what audience you're sitting in front of, if you're meeting with a congressional office, or you're talking to the local mayor or your local assembly person, right? Depends on the audience, what sort of level of detail you're sharing with them. Maybe you're asking them to vote a specific way. Maybe you're asking for them to help, I don't know, waive metering fees on a paid parking lot by your organization on Sunday afternoons so that more local volunteers will come down, right? It depends on the context of what you're asking. So that's why it's not necessarily lobbying, but there are elements of all three in our last bullet there. Next slide, please. So I've mentioned twice now, Caden and I are based here in Washington, DC. We are registered lobbyists. And our work at Mentor is all about driving from our lens the organization's goal, which is to increase the quality and quantity of youth mentoring opportunities for young people across the country. And we state it really simply like that because mentoring opportunities looks different from individual to individual and community to community and program to program. And we really want to leave things as open-ended as possible when we're talking to members of Congress. So we do that, we do direct lobbying with Congress and the administration, which means the White House and any number of federal agencies and their staff. We work with our really amazing affiliate network across the country, many of whom are doing policy and advocacy work at the state and local level in their own regions. And we're working with them on their goals and priorities for policy and advocacy, but also helping them think through their capacity. We're actually really excited. We'll be hiring a third person in this in the next few weeks or months. And that person will be focusing a good bit of their time specifically on advocacy and even more specifically working with our affiliate network. And we're really excited for that person to be able to support them even more than we're able to now and to dig more into this work, which is so important to our ultimate goals. And then, of course, we have to work with our partners and building coalitions, particularly with our national partners. And that is critically important for a lot of reasons. One, sort of foundational one, Mentor is not a direct service mentoring organization. We support programs and volunteer mentors who are doing the work. But when we're here talking to congressional offices and to partners, we're trying to convince them to do something related to mentoring. It's really valuable for us to link arms with well-known and well-established mentoring programs. So think of Boys and Girls Clubs, Big Brothers Big Sisters, the Y, 4-H, Girls Inc., National PAL, any number of these programs, big and little. Doesn't really matter about how well they're known nationally. If they're known in the community, they can be a really valuable ally. And we would not be able to do our job effectively if we weren't partnering at least occasionally with some of our partners in a coalition sense. Next slide, please. So I'm actually going to jump onto the next slide in a second, but I wanted to invite all of you to share with us while I'm moving on in the chat some examples of programs or organizations you think are doing grassroots advocacy well. And I say well, not necessarily because you agree with them, but you think they're being effective. So think about organizations, whether they're local, state, or national, that you think are achieving effectively in grassroots, and just drop the names of those into the chat box. And Caden's going to share a few examples in a few minutes as well. So we talked about why to advocate, and I wanted to talk a little bit about what advocacy is. And I really love this quote that Caden found: citizen-based activism, or citizen-based advocacy, if you prefer. These 4 bullets really talk about what advocacy is. I'm going to walk through them and then circle back to the first one because it's really important. So grassroots advocacy has local value. Grassroots advocacy has a tangible impact. Grassroots advocacy requires exposure of an issue, a challenge, a need. And grassroots advocacy benefits from engagement. It benefits from the engagement of the intended audience, right? An elected leader, a member of Congress, their staff, et cetera, but also from the people you hope to bring with you. So sometimes before you can actually even get to the elected leader, you actually need to get some of your colleagues and peers and partners to join with you. So that engagement starts at different levels, depending where you are in your sort of grassroots advocacy journey. But I wanted to circle back to the first bullet, the local value one. That old adage, all politics is local, is 100% true. Caden and I regularly meet with congressional offices. You are going to hear from 2 of them in a few minutes. In fact, Rep. Mary Gay Scanlon, she is the chair of the Youth Mentoring Caucus here in Congress, and is a just fantastic champion for mentoring. Her staff is wonderful. Faith, her staffer, is just so great and is always happy and eager to talk to Caden and think with us and plan with us, and it's so wonderful. But at the end of the day, if a constituent calls and wants to talk about the same issues, Caden and I both know that our opinion no longer matters. And that's the way it should be, because local value, local voices carry so much more weight. We could be in to meet with Faith and Ken, who I see is on screen, as many, dozens of times a year. And they could think of our interaction as 100% positive. But the conversations they have with constituents are always going to carry more weight because they're talking from the community level. They're talking about what's happening in the constituency, what they see, what they observe, what they know. And that is always going to carry more weight. It doesn't matter how well funded or who is backing the lobbying effort. The grassroots advocates are always going to have the best voice. Next slide, please. I think this is the last one for me. Yeah, so this is, I guess, a little redundant. I stepped on my own slides a little bit, but why does this matter? And we wanted to touch on 2 main points. One, there's a lot of motivations for why elected officials want to and actually do meet with constituencies. I mean, the simplest one is that it's basically baked into their job description. They're elected by their peers. Their peers are responsible for keeping them in office. So re-election might be a motivation, and that's okay. It might seem cynical for me to say out loud, but that's okay. That's probably a motivation for some elected officials. Probably becomes more relevant the closer you get to an election, but certainly congressional offices, elected officials across the country keep that in mind. They're also motivated by elements of recognition. And I think here also saying, positive reinforcement. We're all guilty of this, if that's even the right word, right? Aren't we more likely to repeat a behavior that gets a thumbs up from a colleague, right? And elected officials and their staff are the same, but there's different ways to think about recognition, right? If you have a positive interaction with an elected leader, a congressional office, whether it be the staff or the member, the elected official themselves, there are ways that you can recognize that big and small. You can tweet on Twitter. You can mention something at the local food bank or down the street at the farmer's market. You can report to your board, hey, I met with congressional so-and-so last week, and they said they're really interested in learning more about this bill. I felt good about the interaction, right? It's that simple, but you just shared that with 12, 15, 20 people, depending how many people are on your board, many of whom are local influencers in their own way, who are leaving there and sharing that information or carrying that information with them. They may choose to do something with it. They may choose not to, but that's one way your recognition has a potential ripple effect. And then of course, I think all elected officials, regardless of whether you love them, hate them, or completely apathetic about them, are motivated by being of influence. They want to make positive change in their communities. They may not agree with your version of positive change, but they are interested in making positive change. So this is one of those ways where conversations over time can help find common ground, and that influence, that positive change can be made. And then I guess on this last bullet, before I pass it over to Caden, I'll just say, is a little repetitive from the last slide. I don't want any of you to underestimate the value you have as a constituent or a local community voice. It doesn't matter how well-funded the lobbying effort, the corporate interest, the PAC money, local voices will matter. And when grassroots join together, whether it's a group of 5 people, 50 people, or 250 people, can really have an impact. And so every little conversation you're having with elected officials and their staff builds on itself. And so start those conversations. Don't be afraid to have those conversations. And over time, you will see a positive impact.
Right. I want to thank Abby for providing such a really great sort of basis and foundation for why we do this work and why grassroots advocacy is important and can have an impact. I think that, as we sort of build and develop the skills of a lot of volunteers, a lot of people just know, like, what can I do, and so I think what we're going to be kind of going over in these next few slides before we get to our Q&A is really talking about how you can engage and how you can get involved and sort of what those like tiers of engagement can kind of look like. So here's just sort of some grassroots advocacy tactics that folks often use. The first, people employ legislative or grassroots advocacy for legislative campaigns. We use grassroots voices, organizations use grassroots voices to advance public policy. As we mentioned before, grassroots, your voices, constituent voices are absolutely vital to any decision really that any policymaker is making. And so if an organization, if a nonprofit, a mentor is trying to advance a certain policy, then we try to organize voices in the community to contact the members of Congress in some way to tell them to support those policies. And so obviously contacting your elected officials when there's a policy issue that comes up, in whatever medium that looks like, whether that's, calling an office, whether that's contacting them, via a web form, whether that's social media, whether that's sending a postcard, like whatever that looks like, that's what we're talking about. And that is a form of grassroots advocacy to support a legislative campaign. Media lobbying is another way, another grassroots tactic that is often employed by organizations and organizers. That can be through TV, obviously, if you have, the funding, or really just like getting in front of a camera on your nightly news. Like that's grassroots advocacy too. Getting on the radio, finding ways to get your message across in newspapers. Social media is another, really effective way. What it's really about, this grassroots tactic, is controlling the narrative, especially when you're working on an issue that there's an other side to, right? That there's folks against the issue in the community. You want to make sure that you're doing everything that you can to get your information and your message out to as many people that might support your cause as possible. And then, of course, another grassroots tactic that is, effective, certainly, or has been effective, looking at the history of the world, of the United States, are mass movements. whether that's protests, boycotts, walkouts that are organized by like unions and so on, or whether it's things like marches, like the women's march, the march for gun violence, like all sorts of those massive sort of events that require people to be there and to be engaged with it are another form of grassroots advocacy. So bear with me because this is the first time I've used the poll feature, so we're gonna see if it works. So I've launched it and hopefully you can all see it. So this is the individual engagement pyramid. So you can kind of see each of the different words here. I want everyone to vote where they think they might be on this pyramid as of now. We're just kind of trying to get a sense of where the audience is at, and we'll give you a few seconds for that. All right. A few more seconds here. Just about everyone's voted. So I'm gonna end the polling. And it looks like the majority of folks, let's see, I can share results. So I'm gonna do that. Wow, this is amazing technology. So it looks like the majority of folks, they're sort of in the endorsing, contributing lane, which is good, sort of in the middle level of engagement. A couple folks sort of see themselves more in the observing, following rung. And a couple of folks also see them sort of in the owning, leading area. So that's really great. And we're going to sort of talk about how folks can get onto the next level of engagement here. So one way I wanted to kind of describe this pyramid first is that really what it is like a ladder. It's a ladder that folks can climb as they sort of decide at what level they want to be engaged with this issue in terms of their grassroots advocacy. And so when you look at sort of the bottom rung right here, the observing or following, a lot of the work that's done there is going to be more tech-centric. It's going to be more automated. And as you climb your way up to the top of the pyramid, it's going to get a lot more personal, first of all, but it's also going to get a little bit more labor intensive. It requires more of your critical thought and a lot more of your time. And one thing I also just wanted to sort of talk about here is that the pyramid is cumulative. And not only is it cumulative, but it's also every single one of these rungs is valuable. Any good organization who's good at grassroots advocacy work, organizing grassroots advocacy work, is going to know that you need to use each of these different strategies and tactics within each level of this pyramid at different times and in savvy ways in order to be effective in getting your message across to the people that you need to get it across to. So we'll first look at what this sort of lower engagement, the observing, following sort of rung looks like here. This is the base or the foundation for getting involved with any sort of grassroots advocacy. Folks who are on this level are interested enough to be getting communications from the organization. They might not always be ready to do the action sort of behind it, but they're interested enough in the issue to be reading about and getting that information, sort of in the first place, and occasionally to share it. So one way that is important sort of in this lower engagement realm is to make sure that you're consuming quality media and quality information that has to do with this issue. Make sure that you're educated on the issue. Do what you can to sort of do some reading, figure out what points are salient to you, what messages are salient to you. Oftentimes, if those messages are salient to you and convincing to you, those are also messages that are to be convincing to the policymaker that you're advocating to. Following an organization or the representative on social media. This is, again, another sort of more passive way, but still an important way that you can continue to follow and observe what's going on with that organization or what's going on with that member of Congress in ways that you can get involved. Another way is through joining email lists. Same sort of concept here. Making sure that these advocacy organizations that you're interested in, with issues that you're interested in, that you're on those email lists, but also making sure that you're on the email list of your representatives. That in itself, getting those emails, those regular communications, are going to provide ways that you can be engaged and be a strong grassroots advocate on some of these higher levels of engagement when you choose to and when you're ready to. Through this middle ring, which is endorsing and contributing. And so these actions are, you're receiving the information at that point. and sort of you're ready to take some action here. The actions are going to be a little bit more risk averse. They're not going to be quite as intensive, but you're attaching your name to it too at the same time, and it's public. So you're really kind of using the information that you know to sort of take that next step and advocate for the issue. So one way that you can do that is by filling out an action alert. Mentor solicits these when we're trying to facilitate grassroots engagement on an issue. This is sort of our system where you do a couple clicks, you get a message you can edit, and then you send it to your representatives in Congress. Filling that out or tweeting at your member through the same system is a medium level of engagement. That's endorsing or contributing to the grassroots advocacy happening. Calling the office of your elected officials, having that conversation with a staff member about the issue and why you support the issue or why it's important to you or the community. That's another sort of middle tier of engagement there. Writing a letter to the editor in your local newspaper. Again, that sort of local media touch can be especially effective. Writing a letter to the editor, writing an op-ed. That's another way that you can, another mid-level engagement sort of area. You're sharing information with your community. And using social media to advocate or to educate. So it's tagging your elected representatives with an advocacy message, telling them to support a certain bill or a certain policy or to take a look at something, sharing a fact sheet, and so on. And I'll just kind of put together a quick anecdote here in how I know social media can be an especially effective way at the state and local level to contact your members of Congress. When I was in college, I was organizing around a bill that was a medical amnesty bill in the state that was supported by students at the university. We felt like we did enough groundwork. It was the end of the year, so I was going to Hawaii with my mom and my family at the time. And it felt like we had put in enough groundwork there, where the bill was going to get voted on and eventually approved. Right before midnight and the session was about to end, I was contacted by a reporter who was a friend of mine. And he said, hey, I talked to a staffer of the speaker and they said that the bill was not going to be put up for a vote. And I naturally panicked and was in Hawaii, literally driving to some site. And picked up my phone and organized students all across the university to tweet at their representatives in the state assembly and the state senate. And they got our message and they voted on the bill and it was approved. And so really, I think that just goes to show you that sort of really close community feel that you often get in local or state politics, you can have a really, really big voice there and make a really big difference just by using social media. And so that's my story. We'll go to the next slide. And talk about some high engagement issues. So obviously this is where you really share a sense of responsibility here for the mission and sort of what we're doing. You're invested in the mission, you're invested in the work and in the success of the activity. You're starting to use language like we instead of you. Instead of being just a person who's being engaged, you're also an engager. So here's some different, sort of strategies, tactics that are in that high engagement level. Attending a town hall and asking a question of your representative, meeting directly with your elected officials, coordinating site visits so that the member of Congress or the elected official can come and see one of the providers in the community, the amazing work that they're doing. Signing up to testify on a bill or a policy in front of a legislative committee. Joining a government task force of some kind, and again, this comes from sort of building those relationships with staffers, with representatives, so that they think of you when these opportunities come up. And of course, leading a protest or a volunteer organizing activity. And I sort of just want to reinforce here that you don't get to this top level of leading and owning and really these high engagement, highly effective policy advocacy efforts without first engaging and getting that real basis and knowledge that you need to advocate on these issues that are more on the sort of lower rungs. So, if folks are feeling like, I'm at this bottom level, now I don't know how I'm gonna be able to get to this high engagement, these sort of high engagement activities. You can get there, you will get there. It really starts with taking those small steps, like one step at a time. So we talked in the chat about some examples of organizations that do grassroots advocacy particularly well. And I wanted to list out a couple that came to mind for me, and I'm sure these sort of resonate with you because you've seen them before. Obviously, unions can be really especially effective movers of grassroots advocacy. And we've seen it through, things like teacher walkouts. And not only do we see those really visible ways, but at the same time, they're also doing those lower and mid-level engagement activities that we talk about. Contacting their members of Congress, tweeting at their members of Congress, getting educated on the issues to feel like they can get to a point where they can communicate them effectively to their representatives. Organizations, especially on issues that are, I don't want to say divisive. Divisive is not the right word. People are really invested in them, right? We're talking about issues such as abortion, issues, such as the Second Amendment, issues like that. Automatically, you have folks that are highly engaged on both sides of those issues because they're very passionate about it. And the way that I sort of think about this from our perspective as an organization that serves youth and that is trying to build up our grassroots advocacy network to support youth and through because we know that every young person needs a strong relationship with an adult in their life. The way that we do that is by getting people to care about our issue. Again, that first bottom rung of the advocacy engagement pyramid, getting folks engaged and educated on those issues in the first place is how we're going to build up a strong national grassroots movement that looks like the Sunrise Movement, advocating for climate change policy. That looks like, I don't think that we're ever going to have a Tea Party movement for youth mentoring, in this country, but we want to be able to get to a point where people are hearing our message effectively and they're hearing it in every district across the country. People know about the value of youth mentoring in their community and they're advocating for it. But I also just wanted to mention here, an especially and really historical kind of thing that we've seen in the past couple of years here that was effective grassroots advocacy was the Tea Party movement. And that really impacted a lot of policy at the time too. Same with the Black Lives Matter movement, in this past couple of years, bringing conversations to the forefront that weren't happening as much in the sort of the public sphere. Like that is the point of grassroots advocacy. Starts at the local level, becomes a national conversation. And it's all because of the work that each of you can do as an individual in that tier of engagement. So we're going to talk about but how, sort of some specific opportunities to engage here in the next couple of minutes before we get into our panel. So one thing that you can do right now is filling out our action alert. It's Advocacy August for the mentoring community. And so we have lots of opportunities for you to engage on the grassroots level, but sort of that middle tier, one thing that you can do right now is by tweeting at and writing to your member of Congress. The letter that we have uploaded that you can edit is talking about our Foster Youth Mentoring Act, our Youth Workforce Readiness Act, the Rise from Trauma Act, which we're hoping we'll be able to take sections out and put into a larger plan that'll be moving through Congress in the near future here, and encouraging our members to join the Youth Mentoring Caucus as well. So how can you support that is by participating in it and sharing the opportunity. And you can do that at mentoring.org/advocacy-August. Goodness. Another way is by nominating a mayor for mentoring. Mayors for Mentoring, if you're not familiar with the program, is really a way for you, program leaders, our affiliates, to build relationships with local officials in their community. And those relationships can be helpful for you in a wide variety of ways, whether it's working together to elevate programs in your community doing really great work, whether it's trying to organize public funding for youth mentoring programs in your community, whatever that looks like, those relationships can be really valuable to you. And by nominating a mayor for mentoring, that's how you can sort of facilitate those conversations sort of happening. So this month, Mentor is encouraging each affiliate and our grassroots network to nominate at least 2 mayors for mentoring. And how you can support sort of this program is by identifying mayors doing great work within your state and nominating them. And you can do that at mentoring.org/mayors-for-mentoring. We put together a web page, Mentor did, the government relations team, providing a number of different advocacy resources that can help you to continue to sort of build your skills and your knowledge to get educated on the policy issues that we advocate for. There's additional grassroots training sort of resources on this website. And there's also topic-specific resources that we're developing that talks about, for example, how mentoring impacts foster youth and really helps, with their educational outcomes and so on. We have it for the homework gap, the digital divide. We have it for inclusive mentoring. And you can check out all those resources on the website below, mentoring.org/resource/advocacy-resources. And we have a lot more new resources that are coming throughout this month as well that we'll be releasing as the month goes on. Wanted to just really quickly here give a couple of tips for folks who are ready and sort of on that high engagement level of giving public testimony and really how to work with elected officials. When you're developing public testimony, the first thing that you want to really think about is who is the best deliverer of this message in the first place? Is it you? And it very well may be. But a lot of times the best person to deliver the message is a person who's directly impacted. Maybe it's a mentor, maybe it's a mentee, maybe it's both, maybe it's a parent. It's really just something that you want to kind of consider when you're advocating for an issue, is making sure that you have the best person to do it. And the reason why is because when you're giving public testimony, you want to make the policy personal. You want to make it about your own experiences. And if there's a young person or a parent who's the best person to talk about how their personal experiences tie in with the policy that we're talking about, that's the person that you want to be engaged and be delivering that message. It's always really important to check ahead of time with the public body that you're planning to testify in front of to understand their rules. A lot of public bodies will only give you like 2 minutes or so to quickly present, public comment portion to quickly present your message. Other times they'll limit it. Other times it'll be more of a free-for-all kind of situation. So you always want to check ahead of time to make sure that you're prepared in that way to engage with the public body. And then, of course, keeping your message concise. Usually 3 to 5 minutes is a rule of thumb, depending, again, on the rules of the public body. But making sure that you're not sort of blabbing on and that you're staying concise. You're making it personal, again, telling your story, but also tying it directly in with the policy that you're advocating for. Wanted to give a couple tips for working with elected officials as well. Of course, the first thing you always want to think about, whether you're meeting with an elected official or whether you're just sending a tweet or an email, what is your ask? What is the point of what you're trying to get across? That's always obviously like the tip top thing of mine, and being clear and concise about what that ask is. It's also always really important, and I always think, I think about when I was first getting involved as a grassroots advocate too, and how I was like really scared of public officials and staffers. I thought these people were super important because they're important, and they, obviously have a lot of impact to make a difference in people's lives. But they're also people; they're people too. And I think that's one really important thing to keep in mind, is that like when you're having conversations with these people, you're also the expert on the issue. And so they want to hear from you and are obligated to hear from you as one of their constituents. And so just sort of keep that in mind. Always have that confidence that this is just another normal person who's doing their job. It's important, of course, to do your research as well on the representative, not only about if they might support this policy or not based on other policy sort of issues that they advocate for, but also, have they been a mentor in the past? Is their wife a teacher? There's always sort of different ways that this elected official might be interested in getting engaged with your issue. You can always tailor your message a little bit to maybe get it to resonate a little bit more with the person that you're meeting with. So, take a little bit of time before meetings, before delivering those messages, to do your research on the person you're meeting with. It's always important, of course, to include constituent voice. Folks and elected officials want to hear from their constituents more than anyone else. So, figuring out how to include that in your messages is absolutely vital as well. Make it as easy as possible for them. It's important to remember that these elected officials and their staff are working on a large variety of very diverse issues, to say the least. And so making it, again, as clear and easy for them as possible, giving specific bill numbers, being very clear and specific about what you're asking for is really important, because if you make it complicated or complex for them, a lot of times it makes it easier for them to ignore it and move on to another issue. It's also important to remember that you don't have to know every single one of the answers when you're meeting with these folks. You are the expert on your program and on the things that you're the expert on in your community, but you always can follow up on a question that you don't have the answer to in the moment, and that's okay. because that follow-up is oftentimes one of the most important things that you have to do when having these meetings, is continuing to have that relationship and build that relationship with the member of Congress or with the staffer that you're chatting with. So lastly, a couple action items that you can do right now. Again, send that action alert, the email and the tweet. You can nominate a mayor for mentoring, and you can sign up right now for your member of Congress's or your elected representatives in your community's newsletters. Again, that lower level engagement that can be especially impactful and effective to really build a foundation so that you're ready for sort of the mid and high level engagement activities. And so now we're going to go ahead and move into our Congressional Staff Q&A. And I'll give Ken and Faith just a second here to turn on their cameras, and I'll stop sharing my screen. Hey, Ken. Hey, Faith. Two of my favorite people here, truly. But I'll go ahead and introduce you to, sorry, pulling up the info I need here. So first we have Ken Brook. Ken is the legislative director for Representative Mark Amodei out of Nevada. And we have Faith Wilcox as well, who is a legislative assistant in Representative Mary Gay Scanlon's office out of Pennsylvania. So first I'll just have you both introduce yourself and sort of describe your role within the congressional office and sort of what your day-to-day looks like. And whoever wants to start first. Ken is already unmuted, so I think he's ready to talk. So we'll have Ken go first.
All right. Well, thank you for the invite, Caden. My name is Ken Brook. I'm Congressman Amodei's legislative director. I've been with him for about 8 years now, kind of moved up through the ranks, and as legislative director, really oversee the entire legislative shop for the congressman. So whenever we consider any bills for co-sponsorship, introduction, we're voting on the floor, we have a staff full of more subject matter experts for their individual areas. And then just for an overarching oversight for everything, that's what the legislative director usually covers. But because House offices are generally a lot smaller than Senate offices, I also manage my own issue portfolio too. So I primarily do defense, energy, and natural resources for the congressman. And then I think to answer your question, Caden, of what a typical day looks like, that's always the toughest question, because I would say on the Hill, and I'm sure Faith can vouch for this too, no 2 days are ever exactly alike. There's always one new issue popping up, and as soon as you have one fire put out, you have a new one burning up. But generally interacting with the member to make sure that we're having a consistent and principle-based voting record, and with the work that we're doing is what we believe in and what we were elected to do.
You can Faith.
Sure. So I'm Faith, a legislative assistant for Congresswoman Mary Gay Scanlon. So we're in Pennsylvania's 5th Congressional District, which is part of Philly and some of the suburbs, western suburbs of Philadelphia. I have been with the Congresswoman since she was sworn in a special election in 2018, so almost 3 years now. And have been working with her in one capacity or another since then. So as Ken said, as legislative assistant, I cover like a specific policy or portfolio of policy issues. I guess my day-to-day is spent staffing my boss in meetings or at committee hearings and markups, like reviewing legislation, working on our own legislative efforts, briefing my boss if like something urgent comes up in one of my issue areas, or if she has events, in a week on a specific issue that I cover. And also just myself meeting with constituents and stakeholders about various issues around the district.
You're both busy or something these days. I thank you both. I just wanted to remind the audience as well that we're taking Q&A. You can use the Q&A feature down below there to submit questions as they come to you. So we'll go ahead and go to our next question here, which is, when you're chatting with a constituent, when you're either receiving communications from them or you're about to have a meeting with them, whatever it looks like. So what information do you want or need from a grassroots advocate when they're communicating with you? What's important for grassroots advocates to remember that makes it easy for you to do your job? And we can do the same order. Ken, go ahead.
That is a great question, Caden, and I think one of the most important things to address is when you do meet with the staffer or the member of Congress, make sure you know what your direct ask is, because I can't tell you how many times we've had meetings where we'll spend 30 minutes going through an issue, and about halfway through, you start wondering, what's the actual ask here? What's the point that we're getting at? And oftentimes, it's just so much easier if the ask, whether it's co-sponsoring this bill or introducing legislation that has a fix for whatever issue you're working on, making that crystal clear and then providing the background information to justify the request makes our job so much easier. One thing to also remember, as Faith had said too, when we do have such a broad array of issues that we cover, it's sometimes hard to get really into the weeds on every single issue. And so the more work you're able to do in actually condensing some really complex information into a digestible message that helps a staffer who may not have had any experience with it prior to understand where you're coming from, makes our jobs a lot easier to help you and makes you more effective in your outreach.
Yeah, definitely second everything that Ken just said. Yeah, I think just as much as you can kind of tee things up as far as, a bill number, if there are 200 members on a bill or something, that's important to mention because it might be, a broad effort that maybe I haven't seen yet, or if it's bipartisan, or if the entire Pennsylvania delegation, but my boss is on a bill or something, like that's kind of important little tidbits that might kind of call my attention to a certain bill. I also think that, being the voices like from the district, a lot of the times there's so much stuff that you can't just read like in a newspaper or whatever when you're trying to figure out what's actually going on. And I think that was especially true during the pandemic, when it was just like, and especially in those beginning months when we were just trying to get a handle on everything. So like that voice and that kind of boots on the ground perspective is so important to actually know like what is going on. And so I think if you're talking about a specific policy or a specific bill, why that bill is important to our district and why that bill is important to your work and therefore our constituents is always like an important perspective to bring to it, rather than just this is the bill. Because I think that it's a unique perspective that's super helpful, that I can go back to my boss and say, listen, I talked to these people, they do this amazing work, and this is policy wise what they'd like.
Yeah, awesome. Completely agree. I want to sort of reiterate one thing that Ken said too, because I think it's one of the things that really clicked for me when I was learning to be an effective grassroots advocate and eventually a lobbyist, was that one of the most important skills that you can learn as a person who's talking about policy is how to discuss a really complex issue and be able to describe it to somebody who is not an expert in the area, who really doesn't know everything about it. So to sort of keep that in mind, as grassroots advocates, really figuring out how to talk about those complex issues in a way that's easily digestible to a normal person on the street. Because again, members of Congress and staffers are just people too. So Ken, I'm going to go ahead and have you just describe one really successful constituent meeting to us.
Yeah, I would say this is probably one of the most successful meetings that we've had in the last 8 months or so. After the end of the year COVID relief bill, so that was passed in December, one of the largest provisions included in it, some of you may have seen the Save Our Stages, which set aside funds specifically for the performing arts, live event centers, to be able to get the necessary COVID relief funds because they've been shuttered for the last 9 months at that point. And while we thought it was a great program, everything seemed to be going well. We had a meeting from one of our constituent special events. It was the air races of all groups, who had questions about whether or not they would qualify. They were certainly a performing art, a live venue, but by the, I would say, kind of rigid structure that the Small Business Administration had to interpret the law and how they would distribute funds, it was determined that the special event didn't specifically meet their requirements. And so it was actually another staffer in our office who spearheaded this, and he introduced and got a bill drafted that expands the shuttered venue operators grant program, which is basically what funds the Save Our Stages, to include special events, tourist attractions, festivals that all have really the same spirit of being a performing art or a live venue. And while the bill still hasn't passed just yet, it has a lot of headway going right now. It's bipartisan. We have 20 Democrats, 5 Republicans. So actually more members of the opposing or the other party are on our bill than our own party, which oftentimes shows a really good bipartisan piece of legislation. And we're working to get a hearing on it. And hopefully at some point we have an opportunity to really get some relief to a very large industry nationwide. And it wouldn't have happened had this group not reached out to us and done this grassroots advocacy to let us know what the issue was.
Yeah, I have a similar story of a successful meeting. A number of months ago, my boss and I had met with some constituents who run programs in our district that provide like resources and services to victims of crime. So like child abuse and domestic violence survivors, for example. And they had met with us as part of kind of a coordinated national grassroots advocacy day where other counterparts in other states were meeting with their legislators about an issue happening with VOCA, Victims of Crime Act grants, where they were running out of money and unable to provide services that they should be able to our constituents and to people across the country. So, you know, it was kind of like a big push to alert all legislators about, you know, this is a time sensitive issue. It's going to be running out and we need some assistance here. And so my boss took that back to her colleagues on Judiciary Committee. A number of them ended up introducing the VOCA Fix Act, which we passed through the House in a bipartisan vote, and actually 2 weeks ago was signed into law by the president. So I think that's like a really good example of, you know, a grassroots advocacy push of people coming to their members of Congress and saying, this is what the issue is, this is what it means for programs in your district and therefore constituents in your district. And we were able to get that over the finish line.
Yeah, truly, I mean, both really amazing examples of change that's happening as a result of highly engaged grassroots advocates. And you know, all of our folks on the call can be one of those advocates. I also just wanted to flag one other thing that I was thinking of that Ken sort of struck to me, which is that I think that most outsiders, most normal persons, I'd say, point of view of how Congress works that is hyper partisan, which in a lot of ways on a lot of issues it is hyper partisan. But Ken just gave you a really good example, I think, of a policy change that is extremely bipartisan. And I'll say also that youth mentorship itself is an extremely bipartisan issue that members of both sides both sides can get engaged with, which makes it honestly a lot easier as advocates to talk about the issues. You know, no matter how conservative or liberal your member of Congress is, they can support youth mentorship and sort of the really positive outcomes that are associated with it. Awesome. We have a couple more questions here. And remember, a reminder to our attendees that you can submit questions in the chat or in the Q&A feature. So what is, and every member I know does this uniquely, and I know in particular, both of your members do this in unique ways. So I'm kind of excited to hear your response to this. But what is one way that your boss engages with their constituents or does a deeper dive on issues impacting your community? Then go ahead.
So I would say that my boss actually has 2 approaches, if I can have 2, Caden. The first one is when he's in Washington, which isn't every week, it's about half the weeks of the year he's physically in Washington. If a group, especially from the district, requests to meet with him in person, if his schedule allows it, he almost always takes the meeting. Because in his mind, if his constituents are willing to fly out 2,500 miles from Nevada to Washington, D.C., it's upon him to show them the respect to actually sit down and at least give them 20, 30 minutes of his time to discuss the issue that's important enough for them to mobilize and actually fly out to D.C. for. Getting in front of the member is always one of the most effective ways for grassroots outreach because we as staffers, I would say, have a lot of discretion in what we do as an office. But if you get the member to commit to something, he then tells the staff what they have to do, which is either get onto the bill that you are pushing for, or at least dig a little further into it. So that's one big way to interact with a boss like mine. The other is about half the year when the member isn't in Washington. especially mine, definitely try to go to community events, whether it's festivals or 4th of July parades, stuff like that. But also county commission meetings, city council hearings, these public venues where, and it doesn't even have to be on the public record. If a constituent knows that he's going to be appearing before a commission meeting, it's a good opportunity to catch him in the hallway and discuss whatever your issue is. So really just knowing where the member is going to be, at least in the district, oftentimes is very helpful. And generally we try to publicize through a newsletter of what the agenda looks like.
I'll just say too, before Faith hops on to share her unique ways that I know Rep. Scanlon is engaged with constituents. Rep. Amadei used to be my representative, and I do remember him coming to my poli-sci 101 class. So, so that's another way that members get engaged with their constituents. Faith, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll give a couple too. I think in DC, you know, obviously our bosses can only sit on a certain number of committees, and doesn't always capture the jurisdiction of those, doesn't always capture like all the things our constituents are interested in, of course. But I think, you know, if we're having a hearing about a particular issue, what my boss likes to do is, you know, during the hearing, how do we elevate the stuff that's actually going on in our district and how we relate this to, you know, the policy that we're talking about today. So it's a lot of, you know, if we know we're having a hearing about something, then, you know, my boss and me will reach out to stakeholders in the district who we've been involved with, who we've met with, to say, like, what would you ask about? What do you think is important for us to know? So I think that's a good way of, while you're away from the district, still engaging with your constituents and kind of elevating their issues. And then I think in the district, I think my boss enjoys being like a convener. So we'll do like a lot of like roundtables. Like, for example, we're doing one tomorrow with like all our higher education and post-secondary institutions, where we bring representatives together and say, like, what's going on? How are you guys feeling? You know, what can we do? Let me give you an update about what we've been doing in DC on higher education, for example. Or, you know, earlier in the summer, we had Chairman Jim McGovern of the Rules Committee come up to our district to do like a multi-site tour and field hearing about the issue of hunger in Pennsylvania's 5th Congressional District. And, you know, when inviting people who would participate in the field hearing, it was people who had met with us, who had advocated, who are involved in hunger relief in the region that we had met with before. So I think doing that convening and bringing a bunch of people together at once is always a good way to kind of get a bunch of different perspectives.
Awesome. We have just a couple minutes left here, and we got one question from the audience, so we'll sneak that in really quick. You know, I know at Mentor in particular, and for our movement across the country, youth voice is really, really important in terms of how it's included in advocacy efforts. And so just maybe an example or any thoughts on youth voice sort of included in either meetings or outreach to your office or anything like that, and sort of what that's looked like. And either of you can start with this one.
Yeah, if I would say that, especially when it comes to mentoring specifically, by having actual participants in a program to be the youth voice and try to sit in on the meeting or at least join a call, that goes a long ways too, because then you're not just talking to the association or the interest group that's advocating for mentoring, as much as I love talking to Caden, but to actually have a participant in the program on the call who you can hear firsthand the experiences that they're going through, it definitely hits home a little bit more. And so I think looking for those opportunities to join these types of calls, or especially in-person meetings, or at least in these times Zoom meetings, really helps hit home of just who these types of programs are directly impacting.
Yeah, I totally agree with Ken. I know my boss, it's one of her great joys is talking to young people. So this one especially is, I mean, she loves talking to high school students and doing that kind of thing. And I think it just adds, as Ken was saying, like another layer to it of when you are talking to a young person who's being directly impacted by like the policies that we're talking about. And I think, you know, at least in normal times in DC, when like young people come to the Capitol, it's always like a nice experience for members to like give them a little tour. And it's just like, it becomes an exciting thing when you have someone who's just kind of getting into policy and learning about Congress and that sort of a thing.
Love that. Thank you both. And sort of as a final question here, let's talk about sort of effective strategies or tactics that members on this of this webinar can participate in. So maybe if both of you could just talk about what's the most effective ways that folks can communicate to your congressional offices or sort of get the attention of the right people in your office who are responsible for monitoring or flagging these issues.
I would say reaching out directly to a staffer, especially the one who handles whatever issue you're trying to work on, is the fastest way to get their attention. And it usually requires a little bit of digging, but most members list who their staff is on their website, and you can oftentimes find what issue areas they focus on. So if someone has an energy issue, they can find on our website that it's me that they should reach out to and discuss it with. When you are reaching out, I would say start with an email and always use the person's first name in the email that you're reaching out to. When we get 200 emails a day from a broad spectrum, if I see an email that just says hello, comma, and then goes into the spiel that they may have, oftentimes I assume it's a listserv, it's not an individualized email, and so I may not give it the same attention, whereas if I see one that says hello, Ken, or hello, Mr. Brook. Remember that staffers are busy. Everybody oftentimes just get a little overwhelmed on the hill sometimes. So if you don't hear back after a day or two, a friendly phone call to the office and ask to speak to whoever you reached out to can be effective. Maybe another friendly email just to bump up the last one you had. But just because you don't get an answer immediately, don't necessarily give up. It's usually worth at least one more bump to try to get their attention.
Yeah, I definitely agree about the personalization part of it. I also think kind of when you're doing that initial reach out, laying out, what you want to meet about is super helpful, because it helps me in my mind think, okay, I'm meeting with this person on this day, as opposed to just a broad email like, can we meet to discuss issues? Because then you don't really know how to prepare for it, and you're not really sure. You can't really go into the conversation prepared to give the best answers and prepared to represent your boss's thoughts on issues if you don't really know what you're meeting about to begin with. So I think that's a good part. And then once you have the initial meeting, then once you have made that connection, I think it's super easy to follow up and flag things when, say, an important vote is coming up about a bill that you were advocating on. You can always ping me later and say, hey, just so you know, this is coming up, just make sure you saw it. And I think that goes both ways, because once I have someone's contact information, I will usually, reach back out to them if I need more information too. So I think doing that initial meeting is a good first step.
I want to thank you both for joining us today and offering your expertise on the inner workings of a congressional office. You both are such great people to work with, and adore you both, of course, personally. For folks on the call, thanks for attending today. We obviously are providing a number of opportunities to get engaged and to sort of do that basic level, mid-level, and high level of engagement this month in terms of grassroots advocacy. So we hope you'll join us today and for the rest of the month, and our website, www.mentoring.org/advocacy-August. Thanks for being here. I've talked so much today. I hope you have a great rest of your evening. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.